All right, well, hello and welcome to our live session on manufacturing security. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ryan Spurr and I lead our manufacturing practice here at Connection. I spent the majority of my career in manufacturing domain and IT leadership, and I'm excited to be here to talk on this subject. Today's format's simple. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we're seeing in manufacturing and through our engagements and survey data. And we're also then going to move into some questions that were submitted by our event guests as part of the registration process. So let's get to it. Now, there were always certain types of sub-industries in manufacturing that took this more seriously. For example, aerospace and defense is a long-standing focus on cybersecurity for all the obvious reasons, right? We don't want our intellectual property to go to other nation states to be used against us in the case of defense. And then there were other industries that had high-value intellectual property or processes that benefited from cybersecurity protection. So, of course, in these kinds of industries, we always saw early adopters where organizations were ahead of the typical cybersecurity curve and made these sorts of investments. Now, when we flash forward to 2022, we're now seeing risks expand to just about any manufacturer, regardless of their size, their product content, or their processes. Manufacturing is the number one and has been so for a couple of years. Now, what I personally find interesting about this transition is if you just look back to 2019, manufacturing accounted for about 8% of all cyber incidents globally. You flash forward to 2022, and it accounts for about a quarter of all cyber incidents in the world, right? So it's a problem, it's here, and it's real, right? At Connection, we also do our own survey data into the market. And one of the recent surveys that we did indicated that about 60% of organizations had been attacked one or more times. So not only are we reading about it, not only are we seeing statistics about it, but the greater majority of organizations, including those that we engage in, probably many of you, have actually had this threat occur one or more times. And so this is a realization for our businesses. And so it's not just something that we're thinking about, it's something we have to deal with. Another thing that we kind of want to think about when we think about sort of cybersecurity and where we've been over the last few years or so is how does leadership view cybersecurity? Now, there was a time, just a few years ago, and you can look at it, like when we had 8% of all incidents occurring in manufacturing, the risk level was significantly lower than it is today. Now, there are a lot of different contributors to that, but when you look at that, in manufacturing, what drives manufacturers? Continuous improvement, cost savings, so much of what manufacturers think about and do and how we make decisions at a leadership level and where we place investments in capital and operational expenditures are largely around how do we improve margin? How do we grow our business, grow revenue? And so, over the years, gaining support depending on what kind of industry you are or what the mindset and the value proposition for your leadership, depending whether you're private or public and, some of these different things really impacted how organizations invested in cybersecurity. And so if you look at some organizations historically, they might have looked at cybersecurity as a risk avoidance sort of position, and leadership might ask questions like, what's the likelihood of this happening? Has it happened before? If it occurs, what will be the cost if it's realized, right? And maybe organization and leaders will say, hey, we'll eat the costs and rather than make the investment. And so this is an old mindset, right? And this is largely driven by the kinds of organizations that most manufacturers are, unless they had, some genesis or some reason to heavily invest in these technologies. And we're shifting to this world where it's no longer this idea where we could maybe see this occurring, to the point where it's occurring on a regular basis and it's occurring to us. And so it's now a risk realization situation where one or more occurrences are actually happening. And this is creating real expenses for our businesses. And this is a big change for us, right? Because not only are we just investing the traditional way, but now we've got to go after some of these other areas of the business where significant investment has been made. So let's take a look at what's really driving a lot of this change. Now, obviously, manufacturers have long had these sort of heterogeneous environments with lots of devices with different life cycles. But when you look at what's really driving the data behind incidents, attacks, and successful incidents, it's really starting with a major increase and reconnaissance in the operational technology environment. And this should alarm you, right? If you're not aware of this, if you're not seeing this in your own experiences, you should take this seriously, because what this means is that organizations are surveilling manufacturing at a rapid level that we haven't seen before. And of course, this is going to in turn result in future attacks. And we've seen this, right? That this has been occurring for a number of years. And and this is the reason why we're seeing such a high increase or percentage of successful manufacturing attacks actually happening in the OT environment. Now, like I said before, this shouldn't come as a major surprise to most of us, especially if you're in, say, IT or OT engineering or IT security, because we realize that this is sort of the situation, right? We've got one environment, the traditional IT management environment, where everything's sort of standardized and it's a lot easier to deploy technologies at scale. And then we have many different facilities, one factory, dozens of factories, all with very different technology. We're connecting legacy or brand new industrial control systems. We're adding all sorts of IoT or industrial IoT devices. This could be anything, right? I mean, there are just so many different flavors of this today. It could be cameras, it could be sensors, it could be smart building management, it could be computer-based process equipment, artificial intelligence. I mean, the list goes on and on. And of course, these have long life cycles, right? And because they have long life cycles, right, they oftentimes result in end-of-life operating systems, end-of-life software, right? Another reason why we have these devices is oftentimes these things are running 24/7, 365 days a year, or something similar. These devices oftentimes have to be qualified. We have to, put product through and make sure that the product is produced exactly the way we want. And so, when we have product that is operational, when it's working the way factories and leadership expect it to, when it's producing good quality product, we're naturally going to ask the question, why would I have to patch it, right? Why would I affect the firmware, the operating system? If there's third-party, software, or if there's custom homegrown software, why would I change that? The machine is running perfectly fine. And so, this is the kind of situation we find ourselves. We have a lot of at-risk technology over really long life cycles, and we have a lot of different flavors of it. And together, this is creating a pretty compelling event, and one that attackers are taking notice of. So, besides the fact that manufacturing is number one, besides the fact that OT is becoming a central focus to a lot of these attacks and the strategies being placed, why should manufacturers be concerned? And I mean this more from a business outcome and perception perspective, right? From a technical perspective, it's pretty obvious, but how does this translate and impact the business in a negative way, in a way that we can really quantify the risk and justify the investments in technology and resources necessary to alter that course, or at least for your business, right? Well, when we look at it, more than 3/4 or 77% of people view cybersecurity risk posed by OT systems and infrastructure as a major threat. And when you dig into that and look at what is the kind of business outcome they're most concerned about, they report financial loss and or downtime, right? And so, being in manufacturing, I don't have to explain that to you. You understand what financial loss and downtime means to the business. But let's put it in numbers, right? When you have an actual breach associated within manufacturing, that can, on average, cost the manufacturing organization $4.4 million per incident. And unfortunately, most of those events take anywhere from 250 to 277 days to detect and remediate. And so these are really impactful events, and they're resulting in things like backdoors. Backdoors account for about 28% in 2022. This is a major change over 2021. This was driven by certain infection spikes and certain types of malware. And second is ransomware. 23% of all incidents result in ransomware. And so what is the business impact? It's pretty simple. The number one business impact is extortion. 38% of all successful breaches are resulting in extortion of your organization. The second, most important business impact is data theft. And that's occurring about 19% of all incidents. And so, when you put this in perspective, not only does it cost you money if you're unable to have disaster recovery and mitigate it on your own terms, but if this is successful and you can't mitigate it on your terms, this means things like line or plant shutdowns, right? And worst case scenarios, we've seen, we read in the paper, we've seen some really big multi-geography, multi-site shutdowns that last for weeks. This impacts your brand. This impacts suppliers, and of course, it impacts your customers, right? This is especially so. We've seen a number of events that associated not just with ransomware impacting suppliers' ability to deliver you product and take payment, and vice versa with your clients, deliver product and receive payment for your customer, but also when data theft is involved. The idea that potentially you're putting at risk your supplier's intellectual property as a part of the supply chain, or potentially putting at risk your customer's information as well. So, whatever the actual event is, over 51% are resulting in extortion or data theft. And this should alarm us because this has significant financial impacts to our business. And one of the things I want to talk about is, before we get to questions, is threat vectors, because when I think about, we all have finite resources, right? We only have so much political and organizational capital we can bring to bear as leaders. And when we want to think about how do we affect change in manufacturing or change in operational technology, right? These things aren't easy to do. They require business change management. They require us to affect change on top of an organization that may or may not want change. And of course, it requires investment in terms of technologies, whether it's software, hardware, managed services, and things of that. So, what we like to look at is what are some of the top threat vectors, because these are the ones that are most likely to result in a breach in your organization. And if you can minimize these, you're more likely to reduce the number of successful incidents, and of course, the actual threat to your organization and the cost and time to remediate. So the number one threat vector right now is vulnerability exploitations. And this makes sense, right? This shouldn't come as a surprise. We just talked about long life cycle product equipment, end of life operating systems, outdated firmware, software, et cetera, et cetera. So, the challenge we have in manufacturing, especially operational technology environments, is it's often hard or not economically feasible to swap out all this capital equipment, right? And so, if we can't patch it, then these threat vectors in terms of vulnerability exploitations remain. So, what do you do? Well, there's a lot of things, and we probably don't have time to talk about all of them here, but there's a lot of things that you can do to mitigate or, wrap devices that are end of life and at risk for vulnerability exploit, and to try to bring some defensive measures and greater visibility. The first is to be able to have asset discovery. I mean, to even know that these things are in your environment, and to assess the risk and how do you deal with those. The second is things like lightweight hardware devices for virus and vulnerability scanning. Someone had asked a question around, what are the best ways to deal with, scanning on industrial devices? Well, not every device is going to be capable of supporting your IT virus protection and vulnerability scanning. Why? Because they could be really old operating systems that aren't supported by the product. They could be devices that when you place these applications on top of these devices, it actually impacts the performance, right? So there's a lot of reasons that, we can't oftentimes do that. So having devices that you can connect to it and minimize the impact to the production equipment, but still be able to determine if there's viruses or vulnerabilities is a really important approach. Another one is deploying inline devices that can support things like industrial deep packet inspection. And this includes industrial protocols, right? There are a lot of different flavors out there where we have things like ProfitNet and Modbus and all these other things that are on out there. And we want to make sure that we're not just looking for IT protocols that we're comfortable with, but the things that are actually within our environment and could be potentially at risk if we're not inspecting them. Another one is the ability to baseline device behavior and abnormal behavior. So this is really important because if you can't actually deploy software to monitor for viruses and protect a particular device, then you want to be able to understand what is normal behavior. What does a PLC, for example, typically do in terms of making calls to other systems? Well, what other systems make calls and read certain registers on a PLC? What are the typical commands that are being placed against this device, right? And to be able to know what those are versus abnormal behavior. If we can detect abnormal behavior, then we can either take action in an automated fashion, or at a minimum, we can alert the right people and make decisions about what do we do with this device, right? Virtual patching is another one, and this is essentially sniffing out signatures or actions that are happening at the network layer. And so, we can do this with a lot of network devices today, and we can also do this with inline devices that are just specifically designed to look for that. And the last thing that we could also do is integrate logging and alerts directly with corporate SIM and SOC. And this is really important because if you don't have visibility into these things happening, you have no way, as we indicated before, these long life cycles for detection and their remediation. But if you can detect that these things are happening early, maybe these things start happening on multiple devices, you can actually take action. And so these are some of the approaches, they're not all, but some of the approaches that can be made around vulnerability exploitations. Another one's phishing, right? Phishing is a classic example. And this is really more about training and awareness and accountability, and I'll get to this in a second. The third is end user authentication and stolen passwords. I mean, when we look at it, we still see weak default and shared passwords. We see lack of end user accounts, meaning we're using shared accounts. We see individuals using default accounts from delivery of the product. And reality is we also see, and we all have experienced this, where even when we have credentials, these credentials are placed on keyboards, they're placed on the monitors, right? They're just visible to everyone. So, these are things that we see, and there's much better ways to do it. The last thing I want to kind of call out is, the last two is network segmentation. This is really important, right? It's really important to think about bifurcating your network, not just from an OT and an IT perspective, but starting to bifurcate and segment your network for the different kinds of devices. This is part of why surveillance and reconnaissance are successful, is because if you have a flat network, they can see everything. If you make it more difficult for them to traverse your network, you're going to make it more difficult for them to surveil you and then attack you. And on the other side, when you actually have threats come in, good network segmentation will limit the threat. And then third-party access. This is more of an awareness. This is a trend that, talking with peers, that we're starting to see more. If you're investing in, say, hardware as a service, where you're buying capital equipment or OT equipment in an OpEx model with a support model, just be aware that we're starting to see a threat vector being sort of like an insider threat, where third parties are accidentally bringing in vulnerabilities that put you at risk. So just be aware of that as well. Now, the last two things we just want to just kind of touch on, and this is largely driven out of our recent survey, was training and awareness. And, when we think about training and awareness, it's amazing that 44% still think that we're really not approaching training and awareness properly in the OT environment. And this makes sense. These are, this is a different kinds of devices, different domain, different ways that people work. And so, we have to ask ourselves, is traditional IT security training sufficient for these domains? So, one user asked about this, ahead of the event. The truth is, most organizations don't place the same level of security training on people within the OT roles, right? Are we educating them and tailoring the training to the kinds of devices and the way they work? Are we educating them the unique aspects of OT domain versus, traditional IT devices and user devices, right? And another thing that we have to think about as well, that we run into is, oftentimes we think about training and putting all the responsibility on the end user, the operators, the technicians, the people that are using the equipment in operational environments. But, there's also a responsibility for those people who are building, procuring, and maintaining, IoT and industrial control systems in the environment. If there has to be some shared accountability, and there has to be, in the risks that we see today versus, say, 5 years ago, a change in the behavior with these engineers and those folks that bring these devices in, how we bring these devices in, and how do we wrap those devices if they have vulnerabilities in a way that makes more sense of it. And the last topic is cybersecurity insurance. And this is because this is coming up a lot with our engagements, and we're hearing this in public forums as well. Obtaining and keeping insurance is becoming more and more challenging. So and this is largely driven by people's either inability to put the right policies and controls in place. Sometimes this is a result of having multiple incidents, and so insurance organizations are coming back and expecting more accountability. They're expecting more controls to be put in place, and unfortunately, we're also starting to see cybersecurity insurance dropping manufacturers. And when this occurs, that means that the risk falls on your organization, and the next time you have an event that may cost you that average $4.4 million, that's going to largely be borne by your organization. So. This is a great question, and honestly, this is one that it's a little bit complex to answer. I'll just say that organizations are all unique, right? We have unique organizational structures. We have different values. We have different cultures. There's oftentimes politics at play. Organizations, like I talked about earlier, leadership may value cybersecurity risk differently from company to company. So all of these things sort of have to be put into context. What I will say, and there isn't one perfect organizational structure, because organizational structures just by name. What I think matters most is aligned objectives, shared goals in terms of how what is it that we value, how are we going to go after those values, and whether OT still has a part to play and IT has a part to play, or you consolidate these roles. However it results. What's important is making sure that that organizations are going after this in a consistent approach. Now, we've seen a lot of really great examples. One great example just how this actually works well. A lot of organizations will actually place the OT responsibilities under the CIO. Okay, this doesn't mean that when they go into the CIO that they all of a sudden lose their autonomy, they lose their expertise, and they get sort of conformed to the IT approach. But what it means is that we value OT, we value IT, and we value the integrated strategy of our future, where data matters, and we're going to secure the data across all our domains in the most reasonable way. And that means we're going to treat IT one way, we're going to treat and understand OT's KPIs, their needs, their environment, and we're going to apply rigor where it's appropriate to these environments. We're going to do it together. So, that's one way we see it work really well. Every organization is at risk, period. If you haven't been attacked, just consider yourself lucky, right? I will say that, more times than not, larger organizations have more resources to bring to bear to these topics. But that said, not every mid and large size organization does cybersecurity well. I've seen small organizations that just recognize this is a shortcoming. They recognize they don't have the expertise, they don't have the dedicated staff, and so they've gone out and worked with third parties like Connection, or brought in the right managed services for things like SIMSOC and monitoring of their environment. They brought in the right tool sets, the right software, the right hardware. They've deployed best practices in terms of controls and networking, and oftentimes are in better position than some of their larger peers. So I think what matters is understanding that this is a reality for all of us, regardless of your size, regardless of what kind of industry you are. You have to assess your own risk, your own products, and what this means, and of course, go and invest appropriately. In my career, I used to have conversations with leadership, and they'd say, like, hey, why can't we just go upgrade all these devices? Let's get them new hardware. Let's upgrade the operating systems, right? And so I think that's part of that journey, right? We have to have leaders and IT leaders who understand that these aren't end user PCs. These aren't, short cycle data center servers and things like that, right? These are really expensive equipment, unique. Oftentimes this equipment, the vendor might go out of business, and you still need to use this for the next 10 or 20 years. You have no means even perhaps to upgrade it. So I think, if this is your situation, we're happy to talk with you, because I think there's a lot of ways that we can wrap controls and devices around this. For example, let's say, maybe this only represents 20% of your devices that put you at risk, right? There are hardware devices that we can put right in front of the device, and we can do a whole slew of cybersecurity measures to protect that equipment. Basically controlling and protecting that equipment from everything else in the environment, not just IT corporate network, but also every other device within that environment as well. So that's a really important thing to think about. A simple strategy is network segmentation, right? If you're not going to apply some of the more sophisticated inline or endpoint protection devices, or more complex firewall strategies, at least think about virtual segmentation. Where we see it kind of oftentimes done best is creating VLANs or segmentation by the kinds of devices they are. If you just think about OT versus IT, or IT versus guest, you're kind of creating two domains. But what that means is that if you put everything in that guest network, or you put everything in that that other OT environment, they're still putting each other at risk, right? So you might protect your corporate network, and if all you care about is your corporate network, then that might be fine. But if your goal is to also have responsibility and protect the entirety of the OT environment, you want to be able to minimize the ability of, say, malware and ransomware attacks spreading east-west across the network as well. So it's really important to think about how you structure your network, whether it's physical or virtual, and segment it in a way that you can break it out by the kinds of devices. And if you think about it by IoT devices, for example, put cameras on one segment, put IoT sensors of a certain type and a certain risk profile on their own, right? These are simple ways that you can structure your network. You'll know what's on your network. It'll make it a lot easier to add devices to it in the future, which can impact experience for end users, engineers, and other people who may be frustrated with security. One of the things that organizations in manufacturing are doing is trying to integrate logging and alerts, and have visibility to what's going on the OT environment, which is, it sort of has different requirements and different challenges, and then integrating that with corporate SIEM and SOC. And so whether it's your own corporate SIEM and SOC, or you're using a managed service provider, for example, Connection offers managed services around cybersecurity monitoring. So, for example, we use a product that is designed to operate and connect with any device in the operational environment from an industrial perspective, and then integrate that with a managed service provider for SIEM/SOC. And so, this allows us to be able to integrate everything that's going on in the OT environment, so we get a fuller picture of what's going on in the entire enterprise or the entire corporate entity, not just IT managed assets. And this makes us more capable when it comes to dealing with cybersecurity insurance. This makes us more capable when we want to see trends across the entirety of the organization. And this makes us more capable when we want to actually detect and remediate and take action. So this is probably something, this is one of those areas where if you're not integrating OT with IT, SIEM/SOC, you should be thinking about that and working with a partner on it. In closing, our manufacturing practice exists to advise and support clients on all their unique challenges in manufacturing. Our practice has a deep portfolio of solutions, experts from the manufacturing trade, and we're supported by our extended team of solution architects, cloud experts, and managed services for things like security assessments, IoT assessments, security mitigation, pen testing, dark web analysis, and as we talked about, managed SIEM/SOC services that integrate OT with IT monitoring. So thank you so very much for your participation, and that concludes our session. Thank you.